20 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, now we are live.
Okay, got it. Okay, first of all, welcome everyone to the very first, I actually call this a mini conference that is actually being organized by our group, XPE group. I mean, we advertised it as an education session, but in reality, it is really more like a mini conference, because what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to get everyone within our group to come together on a regular basis, so that everyone within a group would have an opportunity to actually share some of their ideas, their experiences, their knowledge and expertise to the rest of the group, right? And basically all of these sessions, in case you're not aware, will actually be live broadcasted and recorded, so that they're actually distributed to all of our social media. So please do not share any trade secrets or any insider information on any of these sessions. That's just a warning. So as I mentioned earlier, these sessions are not intended for everyone to just listen to me. It's really for everyone to participate. And when I say everyone, I actually mean all of the stakeholders of our group. And stakeholders, by that I actually mean our employees, our directors, our advisors, our shareholders, our partners, and our investors. So we're talking about a very wide group of people. And the reason why we want to live broadcast this is also we want to give an opportunity for anyone in the public to get to know us better. And they may eventually become potentially our employees, our directors, advisors, and so on and so forth. And that is our intention. And we also want to demonstrate to everyone in the world that we value transparency. We are always very comfortable to show ourselves. We are always very eager to share what we're doing, so that people can feel the confidence when they actually work with us, or when they partner with us, or when they invest in us. Now, so, given that anyone can have an opportunity to actually come up onto this platform and to share, something that they, hold closely to their hearts, I have actually asked Maggie, who is our Chief Admin Officer, who's also actually responsible for HR, to actually do, a number of leaderboards, right? So first one will be an absentee leaderboard. So the people who are absent the most often will be at the top of the leaderboard. And if there are no volunteers for these sessions, the people at the top of the leaderboard will always, be encouraged to do a session. So bear in mind, attend these sessions if you don't want to get caught. Second of all, she will also do a leaderboard of who are the people that are regularly speaking, or who have had speaking sessions, because we don't want to keep listening to the same people over and over again. We will also have a leaderboard on people who are active in asking questions. So the people who are active in asking questions, of course, will be less likely to be called upon to actually do one of these sessions. And finally, we also want to encourage people to be active on our social media, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And again, if you're active on social media, we'll try and spare you from any of these sessions. Now, today's session is actually held in a Zoom format, and only because of the social distancing measures that are currently still in place in Hong Kong. In reality, our preference, and it is our hope, that when all of these measures are actually being lifted, this should be conducted really like a mini conference, where people can come to our offices, come to our conference rooms, come to our galleries to participate in these in these conferences, in these mini conferences, just so that you can see, that we exist. You can see the people that are actually working in our company, and it would actually give a lot of confidence to partners and investors to actually see that we have a physical presence, and that we also have brick and mortar. And with that, I will try and jump straight into today's session. I want to emphasize again, because this is the first session, what I would really want to do is to firstly introduce our group as a whole and what we do. The main reason why I want to do this is so that all of you can feel proud about your presence in this company, can feel proud about participating and contributing to this company, because there is actually a lot to be proud about. And in case our group has grown too big over the last 2 years, I also want everyone to start to have a sense of all the different parts of our group and all of the different businesses and the industries that we're in today, and which may grow from time to time, so that you will know, who to approach. You will know how to answer questions from your friends and families when you're being asked. However, given that the topics that we're covering today is actually very, very broad and very, very wide, and if we were to do a deep dive, it would take days to complete them. I will only be scratching the surface today. So I would, highly encourage you to ask questions, or for that matter, even request for further sessions in the future for us to do a deep dive on any particular topic. So without further ado, let me just move on to the next, or to kickstart the entire session. Luna, can you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so very importantly, like I mentioned earlier, who exactly are we, right? So, very recently, we've actually changed the name of our group to XBE. That XBE is actually the acronym for Extreme, without the E, Business Enterprises. And as a group, we are probably the most advanced metaverse, NFT, and blockchain technology application company. Okay, bear in mind, we are not the most advanced in terms of the technology, but we are definitely the most, or if not what, among the most advanced in terms of technology application, right? So we will try not to pretend to be something that we're not. So there are rocket scientists out there that are constantly working on blockchain technologies, working on metaverse technologies. We're not going to compete with them, right? We're going to allow the rocket scientists to build those technologies. But what we are really proud of and what we are really, really very good at is in applications, right? Because technologies, if they are not being applied, will not result in adoption. And if it doesn't result in adoption, then the technology will very, very slowly die away, and that's not what we want, right? So as although it's very, very important to be advanced in terms of our technology, it is also very, very important for us to be very good at its applications, and that's what we as a group of companies is actually good at. The second thing that I want to highlight is this, right? So our major, we are very, very blessed because our major shareholder, Dr. Herbert Lee, is a multi-billionaire, and he comes from a family of multi-billionaires, right? So from a financial backing perspective, there is no doubt that we are in good hands. But more importantly, the family is one that is very, very influential, very reputable, and very well connected in Hong Kong. And it is precisely because of this pedigree background that we are actually able to get access to a lot of the resources to make the group who we are today. And I think all of us, working in XBE should feel very, very proud that this is who we are, and this is the shareholders that we're working for. And the last point I wanted to make with respect to our company is this: because of our backing, because of the family that we're working for is so conservative and is so reputable, we have actually been able to resist all of the hype and all of the speculation that is very, very highly tempting in this industry. Okay, but instead, we've decided to move and do things the right way. We have been very, very concerned about our long-term prospects, and therefore we're very, very focused on ensuring that we're actually able to apply these technologies effectively into real-world businesses and to solve real-world problems. And that is what we're all about. So as far as we're concerned, again, we're very, very different from a lot of other metaverse or blockchain or NFT companies, in the sense that we're very focused on the long-term prospects of our companies within the group. Next slide, Luna. Okay, here you see basically, a series of boxes that I actually put in a concentric manner. And basically it identifies all of the 4 topics that I want to cover today. So they are metaverse, blockchain, NFT, and DOT. Now, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, each of these topics in itself requires a very, very deep dive. You could spend anything from 5 minutes to several weeks to complete a discussion on any of these topics. But obviously, we're going to try to do this very, very quickly in just the next 30 to 40 minutes, and therefore we can only barely scratch the surface. However, I felt that it's important to just highlight every one of these items because it would ensure that all of you are equipped with some basic knowledge so that if anyone were to ever approach you and ask you, what is your company doing? What technology is your group actually adopting and implementing? You, for example, would then be able to be in a position to very briefly explain what is it that we do. Now, why are all of these boxes in a concentric manner? The reason is this: the metaverse is actually a very, very broad topic, right? It's a very, very broad space. In its narrowest form, there are some people out there that would deem the metaverse as purely a virtual reality universe on a Web 3.0 platform. Okay, but in reality, we all know that there are actually a lot of virtual universes and virtual reality platforms on Web 2.0 as well as Web 3.0. Now, from our perspective as a group, we do not hold a very narrow definition of metaverse. In fact, our definition of metaverse is much wider, and it's something that I'll explain in the later slides. The next concentric box is the blockchain. Now, why is it that the blockchain sits inside the metaverse box? That's because the blockchain is something that is within the metaverse. So another way to put it is this: everything within the blockchain sits inside the metaverse, but not everything in the metaverse sits in the blockchain. And that's the reason why the box for the blockchain is smaller than the metaverse. Now, I use blockchain and Web 3.0 very interchangeably because the concept and the primary objective of the two is the same, and that is primarily decentralization. And again, I will have an opportunity to go through in slightly more detail about what the blockchain is. And then next we come to the NFT. Now, the NFT is obviously an even smaller box from blockchain because, again, all NFTs must be blockchain, but not all blockchain are NFTs. A very good example is that Bitcoin, for example, is not an NFT, but it is on the blockchain. So that's why the NFT is a smaller box than the blockchain because it is created out of the blockchain. And finally, the smallest box is the DOT. And this is the pride of our group, of XBE Group. It is basically the digital ownership token. So again, all DOTs are effectively NFTs, but not all NFTs are necessarily DOTs. So we have to be very, very careful. And that when we actually want to buy, and if let's say if any one of you in any time in the near future thinks that you want to make an investment or you want to dabble into NFTs, be sure to fully understand what is it that you're buying. And I hope in today's session, I will be able to very, very briefly describe how the DOT is different from the NFT so that you will then be equipped to be able to make such an assessment. So again, like I mentioned, all DOTs are NFTs, but not all NFTs are DOTs. With that, let's move on to the next slide. Luna? Okay, so as I explained earlier, DOT is the acronym for Digital Ownership Token. And it is exactly what it says. The token itself actually lives in the virtual world because it is like the NFT, it sits on the blockchain. Okay, it's just that it's an enhanced version of the NFT because the DOT actually represents a legally binding ownership title to an asset. Okay, and this is not a legally binding ownership to some virtual asset. Because look, right now, as you know, all of us would imagine, regulators all over the world are still struggling with virtual assets and how to regulate them, because they don't actually have a space or have a presence in the real world that we exist. So when we do DOTs, what is this ownership of? Well, the DOT are all ownership tokens that represent legally binding ownership on assets in the real world. Okay, these are assets that actually exist in the real world. However, these assets may be both tangible or intangible. Okay, so tangible assets, again, it's very simple. Anything that's physical, you can touch, you can hold. Those are physical assets, right? Those are tangible assets. And we can create DOTs for these tangible assets. However, DOTs can also be created so that they represent ownership in intangible assets. Now, again, the common misunderstanding is that all intangible assets can only exist in the virtual world. Now, that's completely untrue. In fact, there are a lot of intangible assets in the real world. And what are some of these examples of intangible assets? These would be intellectual property. So they're intangible in nature. They are licenses. So intellectual property licenses, these are also intangible. Contractual rights. So for example, your right to receive money under a debt. That itself is also an intangible asset. So we can actually use the DOT to create a digital ownership token with respect to any of these assets, whether they're tangible or intangible, but which exists in the real world. Okay, so I want to really emphasize that. Now, so why is this important? Because the moment we are able to create this application, the DOT is actually an application of the NFT technology, right? The moment we're able to create this application, we can now use the DOT for anything that you can imagine that exists in our real world, right? So you can use the digital ownership token to represent ownership in, like I said, mentioned earlier, contractual rights. You can use it to represent debt. You can use it to represent a car or real estate. It all depends on whether there's a necessity for us to create such a DOT. And it depends on which jurisdiction you're in, depending on the regulatory framework and the regulatory environment. We can create different DOTs for different types of assets. But immediately with the DOTs, we open up a very, very broad and a very, very wide range of applications which we can use. And I think that's actually very important. Because right now, we see a lot of very advanced technology, especially in terms of blockchain, going into, for example, third world countries where they are trying to use the blockchain technology to enhance the living standards and to improve the living standards in those countries. However, having the technology alone in itself is actually not sufficient. You need to actually understand how you should apply the technology before you can effectively use it in these circumstances. And I think that's where we actually have a very, very strong advantage. Now, I recently saw an article, and I'm not sure, and I shared it on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. I'm not sure whether you guys have seen it, but the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, actually, was precisely on point recently where she talked about, how we should regulate a lot of these blockchain activities. And she said, very, very precisely, she said that people should be protected from fraud and misleading statements, regardless of where the assets are stored, whether it's on a blockchain or otherwise. And that's true. We should not look at the NFT as if it was a totally different, brand new asset that we need to deal with. For virtual assets, yes, because like I said, they do not actually exist in our real world until today. And we're still trying to figure out how we deal with it. But as far as NFTs are concerned, the moment we use that technology and apply it in the form of DOT, we immediately are able to identify what asset is it that we are actually working on. For example, if the DOT represents ownership on a piece of art, then all of the rules, all of the regulations, all of the laws that apply to art will also apply to the DOT. If the DOT was meant to represent ownership on a piece of real estate, then all of the real estate laws, rules, and regulations in the country in which that real estate is sitting will then apply to that DOT. So therefore, there is no reason and there's no purpose for us to categorize the NFT as a separate type of asset, because it is not. The NFT is not an end product. I keep repeating, the NFT is merely a technology for us to use as a tool, and through the application, we can finally identify what exactly is the asset that we are talking about and that we are actually trading or buying and selling. And I think that's actually very, very important. So with that, let me just raise two very, very important considerations, which everybody has to bear in mind. Whenever they look at NFTs, and in particular, I think you should always focus only on buying a DOT. Okay, so number one, there are 3 points. Number one, remember, the digital ownership token represents legally binding ownership title to an asset in the real world, whether tangible or intangible. Okay, all of us have to be very clear that when you want to buy a DOT, you need to know what is it that you're buying. Okay, and that documentation will tell you exactly what is it that you own when you buy the DOT. Number two, all of this documentation, which are eventually, or rather not eventually, all of this documentation must be written into the metadata of the NFT in order to create the DOT, right? So if someone tells you that, oh, your rights and your ownership title, that's actually in a separate document from the NFT, that's not the same, right? Because the NFT itself, when you hold on to it, does not give you rights. You need to look at a separate document that exists somewhere else before it actually gives you rights. And that, to me, in itself is a problem, because then what exactly is the NFT? So as far as we are concerned, the DOT is different. All of the legal documentation that actually legally protects the owner of the DOT sits in the metadata of the NFT or in the token that actually represents the DOT. Okay, so that's the second point. You must always make sure that you look out for that. And the third thing is this, and this is something that's really surprising, right? Because we're all talking about blockchain and how it's so great, it's immutable, and it's decentralized. And a lot of people fail to realize one very simple thing. After we've written all the legal documentation and all the necessary media files and we put it into the metadata of the token, we need to ensure that the metadata is stored on the blockchain. Okay, now I know it sounds like it is a given. I know it sounds like, of course, where else would the metadata of an NFT be stored? Of course, it must be on the blockchain. But guess what? Okay, there are actually statistics, and of course, this could be a while back, but basically based on the Milk Road, the statistics that I found is that 35%, okay, 35%, so more than 1/3 of the top 100 Ethereum NFT collections actually store their metadata on a centralized server. Okay, that is absolutely ridiculous, right? Because when you store something on a centralized server, that centralized server belongs to someone. Okay, and if that someone chooses to remove the metadata, chooses to remove the image from the link, or chooses to break your link in the metadata, you will immediately lose everything that is inside the metadata of the NFT, and you're left with nothing other than the token. And that is absolutely ridiculous, right? So we have to ensure, as a group, we ensure that all of the metadata of our DOTs are definitely on the blockchain. But if you were to ever buy an NFT from any other sources, please make sure you check to see whether the metadata of that particular NFT is sitting on a blockchain or it is sitting on a centralized server. Because if it's sitting on a centralized server, you've got absolutely nothing. Okay, so that's something to actually bear in mind as far as the DOTs are concerned. Okay, so now having explained the DOTs, and it is created out of an NFT. We'll move on to the next slide, which is for me to then very briefly talk about what the NFT is. Okay, so what is an NFT? Okay, look, NFT, the acronym NFT stands for non-fungible token. Okay, however, the word non-fungible has been used very loosely when it's used in the context of NFT, because not all NFTs are non-fungible, in all honesty. Okay, instead, the NFT has been given a very, very different meaning when it comes to crypto, and they've relied entirely on certain technical characteristics of the token to determine that it's an NFT. Okay, for example, number one, is non-interchangeable. Okay, it's not interchangeable in the sense that the two NFTs would have very, very different token addresses, and obviously these are two different things. But are they absolutely non-interchangeable? Now, the legal and the literal meaning of non-fungible means that it cannot be interchangeable. But in reality, are all NFTs non-interchangeable? The truth is that that's not necessarily the case. And this is actually precisely the reason why we have a lot of dialogue and a lot of sessions with a lot of regulators to try and help them and help us understand NFT better, so that everyone knows exactly the area in which we are operating, which gives the regulators the comfort that we are actually selling something, or that we are actually doing a business that exists in the real world and has a real purpose. Okay, the next thing is, of course, indivisibility. Okay, meaning that every NFT cannot be divided. And guess what? It is true, because an NFT, unlike a Bitcoin, you could not have 0.00001 of a Bitcoin. You can't. You can only have one NFT or two NFTs. You cannot have 1.5, you cannot have 1.1, because each NFT is indivisible. Okay, but again, indivisibility on its own does not make it non-fungible. I'll try and explain it a little bit later. Third of all, the NFT, like I said, mentioned earlier, is really only a tool. It cannot be an end product, right? So it must represent some kind of ownership in something. Okay, and I think that's the part that a lot of people currently in the market struggle with. Okay, so let me give you an example. Okay, the most expensive CryptoPunk NFT ever sold was sold at a price of US dollars $23.7 million. Okay, US dollars 23.7. That's more expensive than some of the Picasso art and Van Gogh art out there. Okay, and if you ask yourself, or if you ask the owner, what exactly did he think he was buying when he purchased that NFT? He would have told you that he was buying the CryptoPunk image, right? Because, and I think that's the issue that I mentioned earlier when Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, talked about, misleading statements. Because when an NFT is being sold on any platform, they do not actually show you the metadata of the NFT, which is the only thing that the NFT contains other than the smart contract. Okay, and the metadata in a regular NFT only has three fields: the name of the NFT, which is whatever it is, the description of the NFT, which is typically a description of who created it, when it was created, nothing more than that. And the third field is the link, the web link, which I mentioned earlier, which could be a link to something on the blockchain, or it could be a link to the centralized server, right? So, for example, it could be, it could be a link to, to the xv.com server, and we could decide when we want to terminate the link or when we want to terminate the server, and that's problematic, right? So in order to make sure that you have the necessary protection, you need to at least make sure that the link is to the blockchain. Okay, now, but if you just imagine, if you were to take this metadata and you show it to the buyer and tell him that this is all you're buying. You're just buying the name, description, and the link. I have very, very serious doubts about whether anyone is going to pay 23.7 million US dollars for that. And therein lies the problem, because when that NFT was put on sale, they didn't show you the metadata. They show you the picture of the CryptoPunk, right? And you would be getting the impression that you're paying money to buy that image, right? Which is something that is so famous and so amazing, that's all being talked about in the market. However, the funny thing is this: I know for a fact that the person who bought that CryptoPunk NFT did not actually get any intellectual property to that particular image. Why do I say that? Because recently, and again, I'm not sure whether you guys have seen the news recently, Yuga Labs, okay, which owns the Bored Ape Yacht Club, actually bought CryptoPunks and Meebits, bought the intellectual property for CryptoPunks and Meebits. So obviously, if they could buy the intellectual property of CryptoPunk and Meebits, the person who paid 23.7 million US dollars for the CryptoPunk NFT didn't get the intellectual property for that particular image, right? And in fact, Yuga Labs even said or even suggested that after the acquisition, they will grant commercial rights to the NFT holders. So you didn't even have any rights to the image. And that to me is really shocking. And I think in some ways it is misleading, right? Because when the platform was showing the NFT for sale, like I said, they weren't showing the metadata, they were showing the image. It gave me, or it gave a lot of people, the impression that when they were buying the NFT, they were actually buying the image, or at least the intellectual property or the licenses to the image. And no doubt, I think a lot of platforms these days will try to correct this problem by having a separate document to say that anybody who holds the NFT will be granted certain rights in a separate agreement. But like I mentioned earlier, if your rights only come in a separate document, it means that the NFT that you're holding do not contain those rights, right? And if you have a separate document that grants you those rights, there are a lot of legal issues, right? For example, are you a party to the contract? Are you entitled to enforce on the contract? Did those rights legally were granted to you as the NFT holder? And those legal documentation being reviewed by lawyers to ensure the NFT holders in fact have those rights? I think there are just too many issues, right? However, as I mentioned earlier, in our DOT, all of these documentation are actually embedded into the metadata of our DOT, and they are stored on the blockchain. And that's the comfort that you get when you buy a DOT. And of course, the last point I wanted to make here on this page is the immutability, right? So the NFT is meant to be immutable. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the NFT itself, the token itself may be immutable. However, if the only metadata in the NFT is a link that is pointing to a centralized server, then that link can always be broken. And therefore, the question of immutability comes, into question, right? Technically speaking, you're right. The token itself may be immutable because, it is created on the blockchain. And again, it really depends on what kind of blockchain you're using. But the link, the metadata itself, if they are mutable, and if you are actually focusing on the image or the artwork when you actually paid for the NFT, can you safely say that what you have purchased is immutable? And I think that's something that we really have to pay attention to the next time you were to buy an NFT. So with that, let me move on to the next slide, which is blockchain. Okay, now, look, if I have to do a very, very deep dive into blockchain, it will really take, a lot of time. So I'm going to try and avoid avoid doing that. But there are four very, very important things that we all have to bear in mind when we deal with blockchains. Number one, smart contracts. Obviously, everyone rave about the smart contracts, but please bear in mind, the smart contracts are not legally binding documentation. They are merely codes that are written in the blockchain to facilitate a transaction. Okay, so they automate transaction, they automate settlement, but they do not grant any legal rights. Okay, so people who try to profess that all of the rights that I mentioned earlier about intellectual property rights and contractual rights are all embedded into the smart contracts, that's totally untrue. Okay, so never believe that. The smart contracts are just codes that are meant to facilitate transaction and settlement. The second most important thing about the blockchain is decentralization. Now, why decentralization? Again, like I mentioned earlier, if it's centralized, then you're at the mercy of the centralized server or the owner of the centralized server. The reason why we want any of our items placed in a decentralized manner is so that not one single person can control all of that information, right? It is being held by many different people, such that you will not have a situation where one person can decide the outcome of that information. However, not all blockchains are equal, and I think that's something that you have to bear in mind. And in the most extreme circumstances, we ever, both Dr. Lee and I ever had a meeting with, a technology company that came to us and said that they were building a blockchain, and obviously when we asked how many nodes there are and and obviously before we went into consensus, they told us there was only one node. So if there's only one node, there's no decentralization, because that one node will decide the outcome and the destiny of all that information. And even if they tell you that there are multiple nodes, we also have to try and understand whether these multiple nodes are held and controlled by one person or a couple of individuals, or it is genuinely held in a very decentralized manner. Right. So, for example, there are actually a lot of talks by a lot of companies about creating private blockchain. Now, again, private blockchain is kind of a bit of an oxymoron, because you want it to be decentralized, but yet it's private. But in all honesty, I can imagine that it could be useful in some cases in very, very large institutions, where they want multiple nodes within the institution, so that they can protect the information. However, at the end of the day, given that all of these nodes are controlled and owned by one person in a private blockchain, that person again can decide the destiny of all that information, then there's really not that much decentralization to talk about, and therefore not that much protection. The next thing is, of course, immutability. And as I mentioned, immutability, again, depends on the decentralization. Okay, so the more decentralized it is, the more immutable something will be, because you will actually need to attack every single node concurrently in order to alter the information on the blockchain, right? So as you can imagine, the more nodes you have, the more protected it will be. Okay. However, I've actually also been posed this question, that if someone were to shut down the entire internet and all of our electrical systems all at the same time globally, so that every single node is dead at the same time, then technically speaking, the blockchain would also be damaged. And therefore, immutability, is used in a relative term. So it's not absolute immutability, but it's immutability to a certain extent. And the question is, to what extent are we talking about? And that really depends on the blockchain, and depends on how many nodes and how diversified those nodes are. Okay, the last point, which I don't want to describe too deeply, is the consensus mechanism. Now, what it really is this: when you have information on the blockchain, as I mentioned earlier, and you wanted to make any alteration to the information, you need consensus. Okay, so which means, and the reason why Bitcoin is one of the most protected blockchain in the world is because it is really diversified, it's really decentralized, and if you wanted to actually make any alteration in the case of Bitcoin, because they use the proof of work consensus mechanism, you actually need to solve multiple mathematical problems in order to actually approve the consensus, right? To approve that alteration. And that's the reason why it costs so much and is so taxing in terms of energy consumption to actually maintain the blockchain on Bitcoin. Okay. However, in a lot of the modern blockchains, we have a variety of different types of consensus mechanisms today. We have proof of stake, for example. We have proof of stake authority, and essentially, it's always a combination of democracy, so a little bit of voting, plus a little bit of how many tokens do you own that you are staking in order to be able to be in a position to give your consensus or to give your agreement. So that's what the consensus mechanism is all about. It's about making changes to the information on the blockchain, and everybody, all of the nodes need to agree before that change can be made. So that's what it's all about. Again, like I said, I'm sure I have confused quite a number of you already, but this requires a much deeper discussion. But just remember those 4 things when people talk about blockchain. And with that, let's move on to the metaverse. Next slide, Luna. Okay, so this is the final slide. Which is the metaverse. And again, I'm going to go through it very, very quickly. As I mentioned earlier, the narrowest definition of the metaverse is a virtual world sitting on a Web 3.0 platform. Okay, that's the narrowest version of metaverse. Okay, but as a group, we hold a much wider definition of metaverse, because we understand that the metaverse cannot be just one thing, right? It needs to be an interoperation between a lot of different concepts. For example, there are a total of 6 concepts here that you need to deal with. So there is the virtual versus the real world, right? And like I said, the blockchain, the tokens, those are actually in the virtual world. The real world will have both tangible and intangible assets, right? And that's what you see on the right side. Which I've already explained earlier, what intangible assets are and what tangible assets are. And thirdly, is the fact that there is Web 2.0 and there's Web 3.0. Okay, a very good example of Web 2.0 and Web 3.0 would be Decentraland, for example. Is a virtual land that exists on a Web 3.0 platform, right? Alternatively, you have Roblox, which is also a virtual world, but they are sitting on a Web 2.0 platform because that's a centralized server that only Roblox controls, right? So as far as we are concerned as a group, the metaverse is really effectively an interoperation and an interaction of all of these 6 concepts. And that's where we are trying to find the most applications for metaverse technologies, for blockchain technologies, and for NFT technologies. But right now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, this session, the DOT, which is the digital ownership token, is the single application that our group is most proud of, and we can see it being utilized in many industries for many different types of assets. And we are very happy to work with technology experts who are great at building blockchain, who are great at building virtual worlds. We would love to work with them, but our role is not to create or not to be technologically advanced. However, our role is to take those technologies and find the most advanced ways to actually apply them so that there will be mainstream adoption. So with that, I end my my very, very little sharing session. if anyone has any questions, let's open up the floor to anyone with questions. We have roughly about 13 minutes to go through any questions that anyone may have. So over to you, Luna.
Hi, so I have one question, Julian. First, thank you so much for your sharing. You have mentioned before that about 35% of NFT on Ethereum, the metadata are actually not written or not stored in decentralized storage. So I wondered, are companies DOT, if they are sitting on IPFS? I actually don't have much understanding of it. Can you elaborate more, like how our files are stored in decentralized storage?
Okay, sure. So look, at the end of the day, as far as storage is concerned, is always still on the internet effectively, right? And when you say centralized server, then of course it's just basically someone's it's a page or a link to someone's web domain. Okay, when you want to store metadata in a decentralized manner, not necessarily on a blockchain, and I say that because you mentioned IPFS. So IPFS actually stands for Interplanetary File System. Okay, and how it works is that it works like BitTorrent. I don't know, how many of us here on this conference has ever used BitTorrent, where people used to share music and video files on BitTorrent. And what it happens is that how it actually works is that multiple different people with the same file they have on their server. They connect it to the internet so that anyone else who wants to then download that file can retrieve the information from multiple sources. Okay, and the more sources there are and available, the quicker the downloading will be. Okay, and I think that's how BitTorrent works, right? However, the problem with BitTorrent system is that you actually need to seed it, right? So you need to, at any one point in time, you need to make sure that there is at least one server within the network that is hooked up to the cloud for people to continue to download on it, right? If there comes a day where all of the seeds are closed out, then technically speaking, you will again have a broken link. Okay, so don't assume that if it's IPFS and therefore it's slightly decentralized and therefore your metadata is safe. And I think Kok Ngan is on this call, but I won't put him on the spot. But that's something that that he's really emphasized, that we need to seed that data on a continuous basis to make sure that it never disappears from the IPFS. Now, what we have done differently is that we have stored all of our metadata on Arweave. Okay, and Arweave is actually, again, like I told you, these are rocket scientists building this amazing blockchain technology, for storage in particular. And what we've done is that we've put all of our metadata on Arweave. And why have we done that? Okay, because Arweave has a very amazing service where for a one-time payment, Arweave will actually guarantee. I mean, of course, as long as the company exists and as long as the insurance that they've purchased to protect this information continue to exist. Okay, Arweave has at least guaranteed that metadata or the information will be available on their blockchain for 200 years. Okay, and that is why this is what we call the gold standard. We make sure that all of the metadata we have, which includes all of the legal documentation that I mentioned earlier, are actually on the Arweave blockchain, secured for 200 years. I hope that answers your question, Luna.
Yeah, thank you. And Getty actually have a question for you.
Sure.
So can you articulate what the USP of XBE, collectibles, and Mavian is, either collectively or as individual companies?
Okay, so look, What I've done earlier is to explain, our single strongest application for the NFT technology, which is the DOT. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, DOT actually applies to any kind of assets in the real world, whether tangible or intangible. Okay, but as a company or as a group, we actually broken up into several different companies. And as you correctly mentioned, Luna, we have collectibles, and collectibles is actually in the art and collectibles industry, right? So anything that's art related to art, anything that's related to sports collectibles, or movie collectibles, all of that fall under uh, that industry, and therefore it comes under collectibles. And what collectibles does is that collectibles then takes the DOT application technology and apply it in the arts and collectible industry. The second company, obviously, is Marvian. That you've mentioned. Marvian is essentially similarly using the DOT application technology and applying it in the media and entertainment space, right? So the media and entertainment space is obviously very, very broad. It includes, for example, the virtual universe, and therefore virtual land. It includes, any kind of media entertainment. So it could cover news, cover music, cover movies, dramas, and that's the reason why we have in-house, two production companies that are producing one of the best and greatest productions in Hong Kong today, and they will feed this content into Marvian, so that Marvian can then apply the DOT technology to them and to those assets, those media and entertainment assets in the media and entertainment industry. Now, third, I think you also mentioned XBE. XBE, as I mentioned earlier, is the acronym for Extreme Business Enterprises, but it's essentially a group. What we do as a group is that we actually incubate a lot of these metaverse, blockchain, and NFT technology companies in different industries. And we grow them to a point, where they are of a decent size. We will then, typically get them listed in the US, typically initially through the OTC markets, and then slowly upgrading them onto NASDAQ. And the reason why we do that at a very, very early stage is because we want to implement the kind of discipline of making regular disclosures, making regular financial reporting to regulators, engaging the regulators on what we're doing, being able to clearly articulate what kind of business we're doing and what our long-term prospects are to the regulators. I want to make sure that that's part of the discipline that we have as we grow each one of these companies. So right now we've got those two listed on OTC markets, Collectibles and Marvian. We expect to see a couple more towards the end of this year. I hope that answers Getty's question. Thanks, Luna.
Thank you. Just an extended questions of the previous questions. So what will you say is the investment case for XBE, Collectibles, and Marvian, either collectively or as individual companies?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Look, XBE is going to remain as a private company because it's really a company where a lot of expenses happen because we're doing a lot of research and development, because we are doing a lot of incubation. Okay, so I wouldn't consider investing in XBE, and we're not looking for investments in XBE. Given that Collectibles and Marvian are both listed on the OTC markets, obviously they welcome investors, and we would always, be very happy to engage with any investors, however small, to tell them, and today's mini conference is a very good example, to demonstrate that we're very transparent about what we do. And it's very easy for anyone in the public to try and get to know us and try to monitor, what we do from month to month. But coming back to your question, Luna, this is actually very interesting. It's a very interesting question because I was once asked why have we broken up, our businesses into multiple listed companies? Okay, and my answer is like this. If you look at Apple, for example, okay, and if you wanted to make an investment in Apple, Apple has got many different divisions. They have got, the mobile phone division, they have the tablet division, they have the computer division, they have the TV division, and there's some rumors that they may even have a electric car division. Okay. Now the problem with, well, it's not a problem. It's really a give and take. But when you make an investment in Apple, for example, you would have no choice but to invest in all of those divisions. Okay. No matter how well they do or how badly they do. So, for example, if the electric car division were to be real, and if Apple had to burn billions of dollars every year to build an electric car, you as an investor, you may not be interested in that part of the business because you feel that it's too early stage and it's too risky. But you will still have no choice. You can only invest in Apple stock, right? And that's the reason why we decided to break ourselves up. Okay, so I look at each one of these listed companies as a separate division, but they're all part of the group. Okay, but they're all separated because I want to give investors the option to invest in that division that they most prefer. Okay, of course, if they choose to invest in our entire group like as if it was one company, they could also do that, right? So they just need to divide their investable amount equally among all of our different divisions. Then it will be the same as investing in one company with all those divisions. But yet at the same time, if a particular investor was only interested, for example, in the collectible industry, and they're not interested in media entertainment because they think that you can't make much money out of it through DOTs, then they could just invest in collectibles and not invest in Marvian. And I think that's how I see. And then the second reason why we decided to break up all of our different divisions is because we want every division to have responsibility and accountability for their own survival and for their own profitability and for their own revenue generation. Right. So because they're all separate, they're all arm's length, you will not have an issue with revenue apportionment or revenue transfer, right? Because everyone, when they interact, will have to be on an arm's length basis. And that, I think, in itself will bring more value to investors, and it will ensure that each management team within each of these divisions will always be on their toes, and they will be ensuring that their financials are in a good state and in a good position as they carry out their business and as they execute the business plan. I hope that answers the questions, Luna.
Yeah, and the next question comes from Dr. Lee. Can you articulate on how exactly a physical artwork can be bound, tied into a DOT or NFT? I guess you can use the example of real estate or whatever physical assets.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Okay, and look, that is also one of the areas of research that we have been doing and will continue to do. Right, because obviously from our perspective, we feel that we're still not completely 100% satisfied with the results, and we will continue to work towards improving it. Right, so right now there are actually really 3 ways in which we can actually connect, or as Dr. Lee mentioned, bind our DOT to a physical asset. Right. The first way is obviously which is the simplest way, is through an NFC, which is a near field communications chip. We have our own proprietary NFC chip, which is very small, very tiny, which we can affix to the physical asset. And in order to provide even more protection, we can also layer wax over the NFC, and then use our print, the collectibles stamp to stamp on the wax, so that if it's ever being tampered with, we would know it. And second of all, the NFC itself, the moment it's tampered with directly, will literally self-destruct and therefore will become useless, which means that the person with that DOT would then have to bring the asset back to us so that we can affix a new NFC chip to it. Now, the second way we do this binding is in the form of RFID. Again, that's a very similar technology with the NFC, but we use the RFID only in a situation where there is enough room in the physical asset, or there's a proper area in the physical asset for us to actually insert the RFID chip. And the third one, which is something that we are still improving on, would be either the equivalent of a fingerprint or a face ID, right? So if the physical asset is actually three-dimensional, then what we could actually do is to take a three-dimensional view of the entire asset in the same way that you do a face ID. Look for all the key differentiating points within the three-dimensional ID in order to determine whether or not that's the actual asset. And if it was a two-dimensional painting, for example, we would then use a fingerprint technology to identify the particular painting. So those are the three ways in which we generally bind the NFT to the physical asset. But more importantly, each of these chip or the face ID or the fingerprint ID will actually generate a digital file. And that digital file also forms part of the metadata of the DOT. That is the beauty of it all, right? So I think that was a very good point that was brought up by Dr. Lee, because there are generally three things in our DOT, right? So there is the media file itself, whether it's a video, an image, or whatever. There is the documentation, which is also in the metadata. And third of all, there is this identification file, which is also in the metadata, so that it will always be stored safely on the blockchain. And I hope that answers that question, Luna. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. And the last question comes from Getty. Who would you say they will be I guess the most ideal customers? He means the users they can benefit most from collectibles and Mavian. Will you say they will be the artists, like the content creators, or could be also galleries and the production companies, or the content consumers such as fans, viewers?
Okay, I think all of the participants and stakeholders of every industry will actually eventually benefit from the DOT technology application. The reason I say this is because what we're trying to do with the DOT application is to actually disrupt each of these industries, right? So for example, in the case of the arts and collectibles industry, buyers, sellers, galleries all face the usual perennial problem, which is provenance and authenticity, right? So by using DOT technology and solving provenance and solving authenticity issues, we immediately solve the issues for all of the participants within that industry, and therefore I think everyone actually benefits from it. It's difficult to identify anyone in particular that actually benefits the most. However, what I can say is this: applying the DOT technology and disrupting these industries will actually disadvantage a certain group of people, right? So rather than trying to find out who we benefit the most, I think it's interesting for me to talk about who actually suffers the most or is disadvantaged the most by the application of this technology. And it's the same for all different other technologies, right? It's always the same thing. The people that are always being disadvantaged by technology are always intermediaries, right? People who make money out of being connectors, right? Being the point of connection. Because the DOT technology will eventually allow buyers and sellers to meet each other directly using technology. And therefore, as the technology slowly disrupts the industry, the people that are always going to be the most disadvantaged would be the intermediaries. I hope that kind of answers that question, Luna.
Thank you. So now the meeting has been lasting for an hour. I think it is time for us to say goodbye and look forward to the next meeting. So anyone wants to give any suggestions or have their last questions?
No, actually, I think before we leave, we need to make sure we take
Yeah,
a photograph.
I
So
know, but
can I ask everyone to turn on their cameras? As long as you are not, in an inconvenient disposition, please turn on your cameras, so that I can let Luna take a photograph, a screenshot. Ah, great.
so we have 51 participants in this meeting.
Are you able to move the ones that are where they have their cameras onto the front page?
They automatically show up in the first list, in priorities in the first page.
So there are only 11 people that are willing to show their faces. Oh my gosh, everyone is so shy.
No, we have.
My
We have
camera won't turn
21
on,
people.
Julian.
We have 21 people. We have 21 people have the cameras on. Not
Okay,
22.
so look, maybe it's not on my screen, but Luna, on your screen, you've got everybody's faces there.
I have now almost 25.
Okay. So
Okay.
do you want a victory sign, a good sign, or just our faces?
That's unfortunate.
Whatever you want, I guess. Whatever everyone feels comfortable with.
Okay, let's just smile at the camera. Luna, can you take a screenshot for us?
Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Cheers.
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 Okay. So maybe this time we can do, I don't know, our favorite sign.
Oh, another one? Victory sign?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
sure.
victory sign. Okay. Thank you, everyone. 1, 2, 3. Cheers. Okay, great. Thank you,
Okay,
everyone.
So before we wrap up, everyone, look, I know I've covered a lot today. Some of this stuff are really, really complex and difficult to digest, especially me using English as the language. If anyone has any questions in Cantonese, in Chinese, or in English, please feel free to raise them with Luna, so that what I will try to do is consolidate those questions, and in the next session address those questions, right? So again, look, everyone should feel very relaxed about these mini conferences. They're intended to be fun, intended to be interactive. Don't feel like you're under pressure. The only people under pressure are those who have not attended. The absent ones, will eventually have to do one of these sessions. So otherwise, please feel free to, like I said, send in your questions. We'll be happy to answer them. That's all. Thank you, Luna. Thanks for the organization.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.
Have
Bye-bye.
a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.